Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
Evening, everybody. Hey, Chris. Evening, Martin. Hey, everybody. Hey, Andrea. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Jean, hey, Lorena, Eric, Barbara, Dina, and Timothy. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Cheryl and Bridget. Hey, Nancy and Karen.
Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid clarinet and the even more torrid band.
Christy and Dad. Hey, Jolynn. Nancy in Denver. Hey, Emily. Hey, Kathleen, Becky, Sue, Trish, Kimberly, Todd, Joy, Betsy. Oh, look who's here already. Yeah. Hey, Dory. Hey, Cindy. Hey, Trish. Hey, Kimberly. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Catherine. Evening, Laura. Thanks for hitting the share button. Hey, Dina and Jolynn. Hey, Toby. Hey, Vicky and Sherry. Hey, Jordana. Tato, who loves you, baby? Hey, Susan. Hey, Lydia. Hey, Maria, Bruce, Bridget. Who loves all of you, babies? Sorry, I was just watching a lot of Players Club commercials. You ever get that thing where you just remember some weird product? You know, you remember the commercials of it, but not quite what the product was, and you go down a YouTube rabbit hole? A guy from Kojak advertising hotel discount cards. Hey, Alexandra. Hey, Heather, Alexandra, Sue, Casey. Hey, Ellie over on YouTube from Ohio. Hey, Ann. Hey, Octavio. Hey, Doreen. Hey, good to have you for a second here, Heather. Hey, David and Cheryl. Hey, Mom. Yeah, I vaguely remember watching a lot of commercials for the Players Club card with the guy from Kojak, which I had never seen, but spouting all of his catchphrases from Kojak, which, again, I had never seen. Maria, let me see. Yes, Priya is right on the couch over there. That is Priya in the background. Hey, Audrey. Thanks for sharing all over Facebook. Hey, Christine. Telly Savalas, that's the guy. Tato, I'm getting some next week. Hey, Ian. Welcome back, Ian. One of the people I've been talking about today is the kind of guy who would legit go around saying, hey, who loves you, baby? Hey, Rose, hey, Lee. And hey, look what I got. I finally actually seen a copy. They sent me a box of them. Hey, Jackie, hey, Lisa, hey, Kelly, Melissa, Luann. Definitely R.I.P. to Bell Hooks, Natalie. Hey, Betty. Hope the choir concert was good. I just watched a YouTube clip of a kids choir doing Real Love by John Lennon. It was just fantastic. Hey, Maureen. Hey, Jean. Hey, Doreen. And Carol. Speaking of John Lennon, look, I got a mug just like the ones they're constantly drinking out of at Apple Core and Get Back. I'm so excited about this. Now I just need every single outfit that everybody wears in that movie. Hey, Michelle. Hey, Lynn and Joyce. Hey, Karen. Anybody I might have missed while I was talking about Telly Savalas? It's a good day to organize your shock drawer. Hey, Sherlock. Hey, Joanne. Catherine. Hey, Susan. Miles is just lounging about on the desk here. He's sitting on Daddy's stash. Well, that's the stash. That's an old one. That's like from... I remember I had one of these right before my last Kidlit event, right before the pandemic. I wasn't getting through that sober. Hey, Amy. Hey, Carol. Hey, Michelle. Carol, no, I've never watched The Voice. Susan, this is just as good as Bible study, surely. I just almost remember the Hebrew word for socks. Like gibberim, something. Bonnie, get well soon. Hello, Richard. Me recall the day you came along. All right, mail is closing down. Evening in. Hey, Kathleen. Erev Tov, Lisa. Ad Pasadir. Hello, Sandy. Don't fall off your chair. Evening, Joanne. And both of the cats are hanging here. Miles is hanging out right here on the desk. You can see Priya in the background on the couch. Hey, Ann. Hey, Nancy. Try to scroll back. Somebody just said something about medieval times. Right before the plague, yep. Right before the Master of Revels shut down all of the Kidlit events. Hello, Lynn. Hey, Marcia. Priya in the background on the couch. Hey, Rosalinda. Hi, everybody. Hi, Sandra. Hi, Rosalinda. I am doing well. You know, I have not been to the new medieval torture museum next to the Chicago Theater. It looks... I don't know. Not for me. I've been to the torture museum they've got at Medieval Times. Hey, Laura, welcome back. Yep, we're still kicking. Hey, Patty. Hey, Jim. Joanne, I might have been talking to another Joanne. We have a lot of Joannes around here. Hey, Lauren. Hey, Jacqueline. Ah, Todd, enjoy. Evening, Geraldine. Octavio, sometimes I make it out to the Ren Fair. Sometimes. Miles is just desperate for some pets over here. Yeah, well, you can't. We're going to let Benny Goodman do one more song. Evening, Kathy.
And they all loved it. They all loved those passages.
Hey, Jan. Hey, Jeff.
And now another one just in the same vein. Rosetta.
Hey, Jacqueline. Welcome back. Katie, I will do my best. And hi, John. Hey, Michelle. Hey, Cindy. Hey, Becky. Hi, Ols. Don't knock that down. Don't knock that down either. Oh, no, I was going to leave it. Oh, my. And hey, Ashley. Semper Fi, Gary. Hey, Dana. James, not a lot, no. Hey, Paula. There's a lot to compare between the Devil in the White City version of the home story and the one in my book. Oh, look who's come to join us here. Priya's down on the desk now. Hey, Leah. Hey, Mary. We got both of the cats sitting on my messy desk. Hey, Aviva. Hey, Pam. Thanks for the plug, Lauren. Hey, CJ. Yes, we'll get the toy out a little later. Priya is reaching for it now, but you guys, you gotta wait until after Daddy's done with the main talking part. Oh, you poor thing. I know. I'm sure you'll see some leaps afterwards. Hey, Mary Ventresco. Hey, Cupcake Likes over on YouTube. Hey, Megan. All right, Benny is wrapping up. And you know what that means for us?
Music by Benny Goodman is being presented
From the Joseph Urban Room in the Times Hotel in downtown Chicago.
And now Benny Goodman's arrangement of The Bugle Call Rang.
All right, everybody, the Benny Goodman music is wrapping up. That means it is time for me to go ahead and get started. Welcome along, everybody. Welcome. Priya welcomes you over here on the desk as well. She's getting a little more bold these days. So welcome along. I'm Adam Saltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, and I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time, including I got to go to L.A. next month for one, apparently. A very quick trip. So I am incredibly famous, after all. You should definitely pay attention to whatever I say. Among the books relevant to today's conversation are Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry, and the brand new Murder Maps USA. And I don't even just put up the graphic of that one. I finally got a box of these in the mail today. I gotta say, this is a handsome volume. I mean, I wasn't much involved with the pictures portion of it. I just wrote the text. But still, this is a really handsome volume. Now, the old giveaways that we used to do here got me in some trouble with PayPal and Venmo, but I do have an entire box of these. So, we're going to try something out here. Down below here is the address for the Patreon. You might remember when we did giveaways, you could also enter just by sending me a message on Patreon. It's kind of like writing parents' brains on a 3x5 card and mailing it in. Send me a message or sign up on the Patreon tonight, and you are entered into a waffle, not a raffle. We don't do raffles around here. No. Well, a waffle for a signed copy of Murder Maps USA. Really a handsome volume. I'm very surprised at this. But it actually covers one of the things that we've got going here tonight, which I'm not going to cover in any great detail because we just covered it really on Sunday. But of course, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre happened right in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Now, today we are going to be talking about Lincoln Park and Lakeview. These are two neighborhoods about 2-3 miles directly north of the Loop and directly south of where I am right now. So, welcome around, everybody. I'm Adam Saltzer for Mysterious Chicago. We're just going to cruise around to some of my favorite strange locations and strange historical sites around Lakeview and Lincoln Park, starting with this place over on Halsted Street that is known as the Tonic Room. Well, it used to be known as the Tonic Room. It's been several different things over the years. Allegedly, it was a North Side mob hangout back in the 1920s, and it is right around the corner from the Biograph Theater, where John Dillinger was eventually shot, but it is now known as the Golden Dagger. Originally, it was called the Tonic Room. Before that, it was called the Everlay Club, not to be confused with the real Everlay Club, the fanciest brothel in town, which was clear on the other side of town. And in the 1970s, for a while, it was an occult bookshop, featured in this rather early 1970 article about neo-paganism. Really, for a 1970 article on the subject, it's really not that bad. But this was an occult bookstore, and down in the basement, there was also a cult group. And I'm not saying a cult, this was actually a cult meeting down there. And when they were digging around down in the basement one time, they found this dagger buried underneath it with a skull head on it. It was really creepy. It was rusted all to hell, and for the longest time they just kept it rolled up in a towel like this. It was appears to have been a group known as the Sabians, so it is difficult. There was also, apparently they told me at the time, some Aleister Crowley group was meeting there, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So they could only really speculate as to what this dagger was. It wasn't the kind that you could really use to stab somebody. It was very rusted, but it didn't look like it had ever been all that sharp. Various people we talked to had different ideas as to what it might have been used for. But as you see, they have now renamed the place the Golden Dagger, and I understand that they've got that dagger now framed up on the wall. I haven't been in there in quite a long time. I should really check it out again. But right across the street from it was one of the more interesting old ghost stories. Now, right on the corner here is Halstead and Lill. You might have heard me talking about Mr. John Lill of the Lill Diversey Brewery, who turns up on the Rose Hill Tour. He was involved in the biggest sex scandal of 1862, when a 16-year-old friend of the family came to live with him. She became pregnant, then sued him for breach of promise because she said it was his baby and he'd planned to marry her, but then decided not to. 300 witnesses, but they couldn't establish that he had really planned to marry her. But he's the namesake of this street in any case. And right here, it's not the same building, but back in the 1800s, there was, back when the numbering system was different, there was a whole article about this rickety old frame building. Rickety Frame House, southwest corner of North Halstead and Lill Avenue. Is there a spook in the garret? The story went that anybody who went into this place and tried to stay up on the top floor would be awakened by seeing a ghost that would chase them out of the place. They described it as a woman standing there with burning sulfur in her hand. Now, the story went that back in the 1880s or so, a young family had been living inside of the place, and the father of the family went nuts and killed everybody. When this story first went around in the 1890s, it would have been very difficult to just go look up the newspaper archives and see if that really happened. Near as I can tell, there had never actually been a murder on this site. But according to cops on the beat, the story had been going around since before a tavern moved into the first floor, where the owner got a scheme going where if anybody could spend an entire night up in that garret and not get scared away by the ghost, he would give them $5. And nobody ever made it. Now, I think it is probably just to be assumed that he had somebody dressed up in a costume to go scare people. Let us also remember, this is a tavern. It's something we have to remind ourselves with a lot of places that are supposed to be haunted, is a lot of them are places where people go to become intoxicated. It just kind of makes sense that this would turn into that kind of thing. But it was one of those stories that was well known around Chicago for a while, but probably not long after that, probably early 20th century, the old rickety frame house was torn down, and this was put up in its place. Now, just down the block from it a little ways, or just up the road, is the Kingston Mines, which is one of a couple of blues clubs left in Chicago. Tourists are always looking for blues clubs in Chicago. Frankly, we don't have that many of them anymore. But the Kingston Mines has been a blues club and theater for several decades now. In fact, their previous location was the original performances of Grease, which at the time was not that similar to the Grease that eventually went on Broadway. At the time, there wasn't much of a plot to it. It was mostly just songs and skits in the late 1960s, the very first wave of 1950s nostalgia. It was also quite a lot dirtier when it first came out. Now, one thing that kind of gets washed out of 50s nostalgia over the course of the 80s is people remember the 50s as a wholesome time. Early 50s nostalgia, did not. And really, that continues right up to, like, Porky's in the 1980s. But let's move. While we're talking about theaters here, just up the road, you might have seen this Binny's. This is the Binny's I always recommend people go to when buying stuff for time travel pub crawls. The Binny's Beverage Depot in Lakeview, built into the old Ivanhoe Theater. Tom Waits performed here in the 1970s. It is a scientific fact that booze tastes better if it is sold by a place where Tom Waits performed in the 1970s. There's probably not actually good data about that, nothing peer-reviewed, but I'd love to meet the person who would actually doubt it. Speaking of, I'm having some Crown Royal tonight. All right, let's zip around a little ways here. A little bit further up from there. Here we approach it from a different angle. And then spin to 2958. Well, first we'll see the place where they have books, rare, medium, and well done. And then across 2958, an old apartment building with retail on the first floor. Kind of building you see all over the place. Now, this is the kind of building that people were always apt to tell you, this whole place used to be a brothel. It's the kind of thing they say about almost every building that is old enough, especially in towns where they only have 2 or 3 buildings that are old enough. If somebody told me that, I would be saying, yeah, sure it would. However, in this case, it actually turned out to be true. Back in the 1930s, there was a woman named Helen Deal, who had been working over in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was lured to Chicago by a couple of guys who said, hey, we can get you a really good job if you come to Chicago with us. That really good job turned out to be working in this place, which was a massage parlor. But she was working for a guy named Colantino, who she also lived with a few blocks away from here. But after 2 weeks of working here, she went to Colantino and said, I need to get out of here. She grabbed a pistol off of his nightstand. And she said, you've got to let me go or I'll shoot. And he just laughed and said, ha, I dare you to shoot. Turned out that was the wrong thing to say, because she did, in fact, shoot him. She then turned the gun on herself, but only shot herself in the neck and the shoulder. By the time the police arrived, he was dead. She was on the quick road to recovery. Told the investigators, I'm glad I didn't succeed in killing myself. Maybe life still holds some pleasure for me yet. Now, the police were really mad about this, but the coroner's jury held that it was self-defense and declined to indict her. She was let go scot-free. I don't really know whatever happened to her. I don't think Helen Deal was her real name. At one point, the newspaper were interviewing her, and she said, oh, don't ask me what my real name is or anything like that. But she was just barely out of her teens. Shot this guy. I don't think there's really an easy way that you could claim that it was self-defense exactly the way that they usually prosecute that nowadays. He wasn't actually threatening her at the time. She had grabbed the gun and shot because he dared her to. But I also don't really disagree with their verdict necessarily. I don't know if they'd get away with that in court very often. But the police were mad about it, but the coroner's jury said, nope, she's innocent, don't even bother putting her on trial. She was free to go, and what became of her is one of those unsolved mysteries. Speaking of unsolved mysteries, we'll go about a block up here. We just covered this on the morning mini tour about a week ago. And it was featured all last week on the Patreon, which once again, if you join today, you are entered in for a copy of Murder Maps. This is not in Murder Maps, but it might be in the follow-up that I am proposing. This is 661 West Roscoe. This little red apartment building over here. It's a collection of maybe three to six apartments. I don't know how many for sure, or how many there might have been in 1919, when the building was owned and occupied by a guy by the name of Elias Purcell. Now, Elias Purcell most of his life had been a traveling musician and songwriter. Eventually, he settled in Hibbing, Minnesota, where he wrote political songs. Not the most famous political songwriter to come out of Hibbing, Minnesota, of course. That would be Bob Dylan. But he was fairly successful with this. In 1912, he wrote some songs for Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 Bull Moose campaign. One of them wrote, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord," which was something Teddy used to say in his speeches at the time. But songwriting never being the most lucrative trade for people who can't sell their songwriting catalog for $300 to $500 million, ended up getting involved in real estate. He owned quite a lot of buildings in Hibbing after a while. Then after World War I, moved to Chicago with his wife, where they bought this building. Now, one day while they were living in it, and while his wife had gone off to Sterling, Illinois to visit some people, the janitor was walking down the street and noticed that the light was on. And he thought that was strange. The light's not usually on in that building. So he went to open the door and found himself confronted with the following scene. There was Elias Purcell tied very, very loosely to a chair with a cloth over his face. He was dead. There was no sign of violence. The apartment had been ransacked, and his table was set for 3. It was his niece who pointed out, hey, these 3 pieces of bread are all really just 1 piece of bread. See, they all fit together like this. The whole thing had been rigged up to look like there had been a breakfast, to look like it had been robbed. The police immediately said, all of this, all of the ransacking, all of the breakfast, this is all camouflage. Now, that was their favorite new word. This was 1919. The word camouflage had just come into general use during World War I, when it was used, obviously, for military purposes. But now they were using it in the press, they were using it in crime, any kind of cover-up. This was their new favorite word. It was like a second grader who had just learned a new vocabulary word. So what they had here was a man dead with no sign of violence, and at first they couldn't figure out what in the world had killed the guy. They also weren't sure for sure whether it was a murder or a suicide. It was tied loosely enough that he might have done the tying up himself, but that begged the question of how did he die? With no signs of violence, for a while the police were seriously claiming that perhaps he was frightened to death. Then they suggested that if it was a suicide, maybe he had stopped his own heart by sheer force of mental power and then bound himself there before he died. It's really remarkable that they would even suggest something like this. Now, what it eventually came out to be was that he had died of nicotine poisoning. The autopsy revealed that he had enough nicotine in him to kill about 6 people. That's only about a tablespoon worth of nicotine, if even that much. Something I remember reading in one of those fascinating facts books that they sold at the grocery store when I was a kid, a few drops of nicotine would kill you instantly. You don't get an entire drop by smoking a cigarette. A few drops would be instant death. The trick with this is how instant that death was depended on who you asked. Now, theoretically, the way that most physicians describe this, if you actually drank some nicotine, there's no way you could get yourself into the chair and tie yourself up like this. But others said, well, maybe. But there's really just no way to test it. There was some anecdotal evidence about people who had died of nicotine poisoning, but there were only a couple of them. So being able to measure exactly how fast it would have killed him, there wasn't really a whole heck of a lot to go on. Now, the most obvious explanation was that he had committed suicide or died by suicide, and beforehand had ransacked the apartment, had set the table out, all these things to make it look as though it was a murder. Turned out he had just lost quite a lot of money, cashed in some real estate and ended up gambling it away or something. The idea was if he made it look like a suicide, his insurance company would pay his family off. If he made it look like a murder. If it was a suicide, they would only pay a tiny amount. But that left a couple of other things. For one thing, there was no container of nicotine found on the scene. He had also laid out a couple of family members' clothing items where they were sure to be found. If he was trying to make it look like a murder, you would have tried to get rid of any evidence that might have implicated the family members you were supposedly trying to save. Everything was just kind of a mess with this case, and after a couple of days, the only real suspect was the janitor who first discovered the body. And he was never officially a suspect. But his line of questioning that they printed in the papers does make me feel kind of suspicious of him. The main question being, why did you go to decide to investigate this guy's place in the first place? He said, well, I saw the light was on. It's like, you call on 50 different apartment buildings around here. Wasn't the light on in several others of them? He said, well, yes, but this, when I went to look, it also had a key in the door. Really, there was just a whole lot here that didn't quite make sense. However, there was really no motive for the guy. There was nothing really to tie him to it. There were also stories that a woman had been seen around the place. There was a woman's fingerprint on one of the glasses. Now, honestly, my best guess here is it probably was a suicide, and most of the clues, or what we call clues, are probably attributable to sloppy police work, which was definitely a problem at the time. In any case, though, if he was trying to trick the insurance companies, it worked. The insurance company paid his family off a couple of months later. Now let's head a few blocks south of here to one of my favorite houses in the city. The Dews Mansion. Remember, my friend Claudia Gray, who was writing vampire books at the time, used to live right next door to this place. It's kind of cool to go see a vampire author and they're living right next door to a building like this. This is known as the Dews Mansion. Built for a brewer named Mr. Dews. Brewers in the 1890s were making all kinds of money. This was built in 1896 by the architects Cudell and Herx, who also did Cyrus McCormick's house. Allegedly, they were influenced by the buildings of the 1893 World's Fair. Tough to know for sure. They don't write that kind of thing down, but it certainly looks like that sort of style. Here's a view from the front. All these gorgeous statues. Phantasmagoric, it is sometimes described as. Here's a full version. See that cool mansard roof and everything. So this was built by Mr. Dews. After he died, it was taken over by the Swedish Engineers Club. That was in 1921. They owned it for almost half a century. When they no longer could afford to hold on to it and moved their operations elsewhere, it really looked as though the place was going to be bought up by a developer and torn down. A lot of old buildings like that were. This was the early 1970s. But then a guy stepped in kind of out of nowhere by the name of George Santo Pietro, who was starting his own men's magazine called Coke. You know, it's French for chicken. Sure. That's what he was going for. He envisioned it as sort of a more working man's version of Playboy. He kept telling everybody, no, I'm not trying to be another Hugh Hefner. He was obviously trying to be another Hugh Hefner, and this was going to be his version of the Playboy Mansion. Priya, I'm just going to pick you up so everybody can see this. You're making a huge mess. Hey, Priya, it's okay. All right. Sorry, everybody. Priya got her head stuck in a Kleenex box. Well, that's a new one. I have a Coke and a smile. Sure. Well, now I'm thinking of the Bill Cosby commercials where he used to say that. That's not helping one little bit. Sorry. Oh, it's not even really funny. Oh, dear. Okay. Okay, I'm good. So, George Santo Pietro starting Coke magazine, a working man's version of Playboy. The Dews Mansion was going to be his Playboy mansion. And at the very least, the guy absolutely saved this place from the wrecking ball when he bought it for something like $73,000. So, supposed to be, said, well, hell, mansions are all right. I can understand wanting to live in a mansion. But hey, don't quote me as saying hell. My mother would get upset. By every description of the guy, he sounds exactly like the kind of guy who would going around using phrases like, who loves you, baby? He also drove around town in an Excalibur, one of these cream-colored old cars. Now, Coke only lasted for a few issues, but at the time he had several other plans, including opening the first sushi restaurants in town. Newspapers were rather amused by this. If Santo Pietro's dream come true, it could make for an interesting reconditioning process for the American male. Identifying with Hugh Hefner, his buddies, and sports cars was no problem, but are we ready for raw fish? It's always fun to see stuff like this, like the guy who wrote into the paper saying, I found a restaurant where they encourage you to dunk your donuts in coffee. There should be one of these in every city. Like, yeah, sure, Gordon, tell us another. But George Santo Pietro ran up debts all over Chicago for some time before disappearing into California, where he allegedly worked as a camera technician and may still be working as a camera technician. There's a guy of that name, sometimes said to be him and sometimes not, credited as Dolly Grip on shows like The Good Place and The Mandalorian. But he is best known for is in the late 1980s, he married Vanna White of Wheel of Fortune. By this time, he had let the house go. It was jointly owned by one of the guys from the band Chicago, Danny Serafine, who jointly owned it with a mobbed-up nightclub owner. In 1990, George Santopietro married Vanna White, continued running sushi restaurants all over California, some of which are still in operation. They divorced in 2002. Now, the best thing I've got to connect these, that this is the same George Santopietro, is Irv Kupcinet's column in the Chicago Sun-Times said a Hollywood report has Vanna, Wheel of Fortune White, linked romantically to George Pietro, a.k.a. George Pietro Santos. We don't want to get Vanna's vowels in an uproar, but does she know the real Pietro? He's well known in Chicago as an alleged con artist of his own Wheel of Fortune. Among the many local scams, Pietro bilked the wife of a millionaire out of $125,000 and also tried to dupe a Chicago hotel out of a huge sum. During this period, Santos used to tool around town in a white Excalibur. This is just one of those stories where the gift just kept on giving. The house now is owned by a developing company. Sometimes they rent it out as an event space. That's about the most boring thing that could possibly be said about it. Second most boring is that it was owned by a brewer, frankly. Third, that it was the Swedish Engineers Club. But somehow that tends to get left out of the architecture foundation stories on it. Its strange connection to Wheel of Fortune. Well, let's move up a little bit. Just up the road, here in the Lakeview neighborhood, just north up on Pine Grove, now, I did try to get George Santopietro on the phone last time I did this. I found a couple of phone numbers for him, but none of them that got me anywhere. But just up here at 2740 North Pine Grove is this apartment building. Now, in this apartment building, back in 1977, a woman was stabbed to death. She was found slain in an apartment that had also been caught on fire. And initially, it was thought that she had been sexually assaulted and then murdered. But further investigation showed that there was no murder. There was no sexual assault. She had just been robbed and stabbed. Then the apartment set on fire to try to cover the person's tracks. For a while, they didn't really have any suspects, any necessary motives. They didn't really know if anything was missing from the apartment at the time. But then a woman who lived up in the suburbs, but worked with this woman back at the hospital where she worked as a respiratory therapist, named Teresita Bassa. A woman named Remy Schwa. This is Alan Showery, a person who was fingered by a voice from the grave. So, a woman by the name of Remy Schwa started speaking in a voice that she said was Teresita Bassa, the woman who had been murdered. And she fingered a guy who worked as an orderly at the hospital named Alan Showery. This actually came up at the trial, you can probably imagine. This is Teresita herself. Eventually inspired an entire book. This was very close to being thrown out on the trial, but then at the last second, Showery decided to change his plea to not to guilty, and ended up doing time in prison for this. And occasionally you see this held up as proof of the afterlife. And really, I think it's no such thing. These, when they retell this story like that, they always say that Remy and Teresita didn't know each other at all. She couldn't have possibly known these things. And really, in fact, they probably knew each other a little bit, but at least better than is usually admitted. And just up the road from that, though, it's a much more interesting apartment building, frankly. One of our architectural landmarks, the Brewster Apartments. Gorgeous place that clings to the fiction that Charlie Chaplin lived in the penthouse despite all evidence to the contrary. It's a common thing once you get about this far north. If you look for an apartment, there's about a 30% chance that anywhere you look, they're going to tell you that Charlie Chaplin used to live there. Charlie Chaplin lived in Chicago for exactly 3 weeks, spent the whole time crashing on Bronco Billy's couch in a building that no longer stands. Let's go up the lays a little bit. Now, this used to be the lake shore. Here, you can see now it goes about another block, then you can see some parkland at the end of the road there. But there didn't used to be all of this development here back in the 1800s, up here at Pine Grove and Waveland. Now, this was the estate of a guy by the name of Parker Mason, whose house looked about like this. Now, he had been a part of the whiskey ring. This was the thing in the 1870s where millions of dollars that were supposed to go to the government for whiskey tax were instead lining the pockets of government officials. He was a part of that, built himself this whole compound up at Waveland and Pine Grove, which was out of the way enough that he was less likely to get investigated, which is a good thing because he was known to threaten to kill people who got too close. But mostly he lived in a wooden annex and used this entire building as a laboratory. Nobody really talked about him as a dangerous whiskey operator in those days. People in the neighborhood just knew him as a strange, eccentric guy who was always working on inventing things. You could hear these weird sounds coming out of the place. It was like that Tom Waits song, "What's he building in there? What the hell is he building in there?" The big rumors that he was working on a flying machine. Turned out he was building his own windmill. But on his property was this enormous boulder, which was rumored to have fallen right from space. It was really taken from some quarry on Ashland and Western. Some of the real old-timers remember the day that it was moved there. He wanted this to be his gravestone at Rose Hill Cemetery, which kind of begs the question now of whatever became of that boulder. Because unless it's like hidden behind one of these buildings someplace, it doesn't seem to be standing now. It's also not at his rather modest grave at Rose Hill Cemetery. Just one of those local eccentrics. And just up the road from there, at 3912 North Pine Grove. We've been on Pine Grove for about the last 5 stories here. Deanna, yep, he was building his own windmill for reasons unclear. But up here, so by the early 1930s, we'll kind of continue on the gangster theme we've been on. Last week we talked about the Cardinella gang in the 1910s. Sunday we talked about the Prohibition-era gangs of the 1920s. In the early 1930s, especially after liquor became legal again, there just wasn't as much money in being a gangster as there used to be. So the gangsters were all trying to come up with their own new methods of revenue. One of these was a group called the Barker-Karpus gang, best known as the Ma Barker gang. Though whether Ma Barker herself actually had anything to do with the operations of the gang is rather unknown. But she and her son, Doc Barker, operated out of a building in here where they put through such schemes as kidnapping Edward Bremer, the adult son of the owner of Schmidt Beer. They kidnapped this guy's adult son, held him hostage for about $200,000, and eventually got the money. Even though a lot of people suspected that his dad wasn't going to pay up because, frankly, nobody could really stand the guy they had held for ransom. But they got their $200,000 but didn't really have any way to spend it. The FBI had carefully noted the serial numbers of all of the bills that were being used here. So after Babyface Nelson was killed, Alvin Karpus, who lived here with the gang, became public enemy number 1. So one cold winter day, the feds were staking the place out. When Doc Barker came out, they chased him down. He slipped him some slush and was captured. Now, at one point they asked him, well, how come he didn't shoot? He's like, well, I'd already fallen. It wasn't going to do me any good at that point. So the feds broke into this place, shot one member of the gang, and captured a guy by the name of Byron Bolton. So Byron Bolton was one that they had been looking for a long time because after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, the police had gone through the building where the lookouts were probably stationed and found Byron Bolton's name on an envelope. Now, days after the arrest, the Chicago Evening American announced that he had confessed everything about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, naming a couple of guys named Killer Burke and Fred Gates, the ones the gangsters now known as the American Boys, as being the real killers here. We'll cover the St. Valentine's Day Massacre just briefly. I've covered it so many times lately. But up here on North Clark Street, where the little field is now, was a garage where in 1929, 7 guys affiliated with the Bugs Moran gang had gathered around on Valentine's Day of 29, when 4 guys working for Al Capone busted into the place and shot them all up. Now, the best evidence is that Killer Burke and Fred Gates were among them. The Chicago Evening American announced that he had told everything, and apparently he had let it slip to a couple other people before, and now the Evening American just published what he had told them. But really, if he had confessed, the Evening American had no idea about it. They were just saying what he had said to everybody else over the years. It only came out later when the FBI file was released on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that J. Edgar Hoover said that yes, in fact, he had spilled the beans about this. Whether he was telling the truth is, of course, not really known. Now let's go ahead a little bit further south down here. We'll kind of hop around from here. We'll go down just briefly over to Lincoln Park. And speaking of gangsters, there was a gangster named Nails Morton who died in here. He was killed by a horse. One of our earlier gangsters. One of the first Prohibition-era gangster deaths. Two-gun Altery allegedly went and shot the horse. But right about in this vicinity here, maybe a little bit east of this, there was... this was, of course, the portion of this is the northern section of the Old City Cemetery. In fact, when they were digging out the land for the farm and the zoo, they found a dead body and couldn't figure out what to do with it, so they just reburied it on the grounds. And I covered this quite a bit if you went on the haunted history tours of the Lincoln Park Zoo, but there was a guy named Edward Burkhart who was operating a stone quarry and carving shop around here, carving a lot of the gravestones for the Old City Cemetery. And one day, a guy came in by the name of George Hull. And he came up to a couple of the carvers and said, "Now listen, guys, I got this giant block of gypsum here. See, I know this guy who's a preacher, and he says that there's this line in the Bible about how there used to be giants that walked the earth. Can't believe he actually believes that. So I've got this giant block of gypsum. I want you to carve it into a man, and I am going to fool him." So he offered them quite a bit of money for this, and actually posed for it too. Sorry, I was anatomically correct here. He actually, in fact, I should say more specifically, you can kind of see the resemblance in the head, but he himself stripped down and posed for it. I'm not sure if they asked him to do that. I can just kind of imagine him being like, "All right, now sculpt me, boys. Sculpt me like one of your French girls." So having carved out this giant, he took it out to Cardiff, New York, and buried it. But after it was buried, he let it lie there for a couple of years, then hired some people to come out and dig a well. He said, "I need you to dig a well. I want you to dig right in this exact spot." And that's what they found. And this ended up being quite a thing. He not only fooled the guy he was planning to fool, but then started marketing it as the biggest find of the century and made an absolute fortune at it for a while. There are a couple of copies of it still up in like Fort Dodge, Iowa. The original is now in Cooperstown, New York. Initially, P.T. Barnum offered to buy the thing, but then it was announced by the carvers back in Chicago here that it was all a fake. One of them wrote to the paper and said, "Okay, I guess we should fess up since he never actually paid us. Yeah, we did that. If anybody else needs a giant carved, you know who to call." And of course, other people did. There's a copy in Fort Dodge. P.T. Barnum had his own made. He'd initially offered to buy the thing, then he found out it was a fake, so he just had his own made, and turned out it's not really illegal to make a copy of a hoax. So he got away with that for quite a bit. Let's move up onto Addison Street, 522 West Addison, is this lovely Parliament Tower apartment building. Back in 1925, there was a woman living towards the back here by the name of Clara Hark. Now, Clara Hark had already been married and divorced by the age of 18. Now she was living here with her new husband in 1925. Meanwhile, her mother and her stepfather, who was only a few years older than her and was sometimes suspected to be having an affair with her, as well as her mother, were living up in Fox Lake. This is not the same as the Fox Lake Massacre. But Claire would go to visit them on weekends, and apparently Mom was very strict. She and everybody else, her stepfather, her husband, etc., would go out drinking illegally, and when they got back a minute late for supper, Mother would get absolutely furious. And one night after a really big fight, the mother was shot to death. Clara's story was that she had stormed out in the middle of the fight and then heard 4 gunshots, came back and found her mother lying there bleeding. Now, the police came out there, found the 4 gunshot wounds, and then realized that there was no gun actually present. They eventually found her in the next room, and Clara said, "Oh, well, yeah, when we came in, she was still alive and still holding the gun, so we quick hid it from her so she couldn't shoot herself a 5th time." This strikes me as remarkably unlikely, and in fact, it was not considered likely by the police either. She was arrested for murder and brought into court eventually. In court, she wore a red dress, which was considered highly shocking at the time. This really just became a duel of experts. Could you, in fact, shoot yourself in the solar plexus and then still shoot yourself a couple more times? One expert actually said that yes, you could shoot yourself in the solar plexus and still have enough left in you to shoot yourself a couple more times. Others said, no, there's no way you could pull that off. But the jury decided at least that there was reasonable doubt, so Clara was acquitted, promptly divorced her husband, and embarked on a life of getting arrested for noise complaints and getting in fights outside of bars. 1928, she was jailed for drunkenness and was overheard by a reporter shouting, "If they think I'm getting sober, they've got another think coming. I'll make so much noise, they have to let me out." She moved away at that point and disappeared from the news about 1944, then suddenly popped up again in the 1970s. She was just an old lady living in Florida, getting in fights with condo boards that she said were, and zoning boards that she said were racist and discriminatory. But she was one that the newspapers liked to talk about quite a lot when her story first came out. Genevieve Forbes Herrick wrote quite a lot about her. She was Chicago Tribune's ace crime reporter for a while there. It's difficult to know why that particular story went out of fashion. It's always kind of, I guess it's because nobody rewrote the story 20 years later. It's usually how it goes. Now, just around the corner from here is Alta Vista Terrace, which we just kind of walked down. And this was a planned street. Now, the two streets have identical townhouses that are mirror images of each other. If you go down one direction, you see all the same styles as the other. It's kind of a little miniature village. We'll just stroll down here a little ways. Fascinating mix of architectural styles of the era. I'll kind of speed it up a bit. And when it turns around, you can see a lot of the same styles just on the other end of the street. This is a landmark neighborhood. And I think I got time for one more. Now, this one may come up again. I may do the Shooting Showgirls presentation again pretty soon. But just a couple of blocks from Wrigley Field, you can see Wrigley down the road there, is the Hotel Carlos. It's now apartments, but it was actually a hotel back in 1932, and was the living quarters of Chicago Cubs great Billy Jurgis. But Billy Jurgis had an on-again, off-again girlfriend named Violet Popovich. Now, she was what was called a baseball Annie, which is a 1930s term for a groupie. At one time, both the Cubs and the White Sox were managed by people who had once been romantically connected to Violet Popovich, also known as Violet Valley. That was her stage name. But after Billy broke things off with her, one day she decided to come into his room here and shoot him. This is sometimes said to have been the inspiration for the movie The Natural, but there's a couple of different variations of what inspired that. But Billy was not seriously injured. He was able to get back on stage pretty quickly. She herself would just say, "Oh, it's an odd thing, this being in love," and decided to take her act on the stage. Having gained a measure of fame by this, she started appearing at a theater at State and Congress in a show called The Bear Cub Follies. Exactly what happened in this show is not particularly well recorded, but by all accounts, it really sucked. All right. So those are some strange tales of Lakeview and Lincoln Park. Sunday morning, that should actually say 10 a.m., not 8 p.m. I knew I was doing something wrong there. But we'll be doing Unsolved Mysteries from Chicago History. I thought I'd just done that one, but it turns out I've been doing it for libraries and stuff. I haven't done it here in several months. So we'll do that on Sunday morning. And next Wednesday at a special evenings, Thursday might not work for me next week. Next Wednesday, Time Travel Pub Crawl presents Drink Like the Dickens. We are going to go around to some Victorian and Dickensian pubs around the world virtually and recreate drinks out of Charles Dickens books like Egg Hot, Smoking Bishop, Dickens' own recipe for punch. If you go to the event listing, there's a lot of links to how to make these things. Really fascinating stuff. And of course, we do mini tours every day. That is continuing. Should you need a mysterious Chicago sweatshirt, t-shirt, hoodie, etc., cafepress.com/mysteriouschicago has you all set up. While I leave that up, I will also say over on Patreon, send a message to the Patreon today to get entered for a copy of Murder Maps USA, this very handsome hardcover volume. of which they just sent me 10 copies, called Engrossing by Library Journal, and A Cornucopia of Crime by the New York Times. A veritable cornucopia of crime. I'd say to be an alleged cornucopia. And with that, everybody, I will put the Benny Goodman back on, and we will hang out. That's either send me a message on the Patreon or sign up on the Patreon to get entered in the waffle. We don't do raffles around here. I'm not some kind of gambling kingpin. I'll put the Benny Goodman back on, and we will just hang out like we always do. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I should probably go comfort Priya a little bit, too. Hey, Jacqueline, thanks. No money involved here. No money involved. No money involved in this waffle. Just either sign up for the Patreon or send me a message. Hey, Catherine, enjoy winter break. Be glad to have you back at 10 a.m. Any limoncello? I only have the LaCroix limoncello on me. Oh yeah, if you're watching over on YouTube, there is a whole group here on Facebook called Mysterious Chicago Regulars and Miles Fan Club. Here's Miles right now. I'll get him jumping in a couple of minutes. Now that is the first time I have known Priya to get, Bridget, that's the first time I've known her to get her head stuck in a box of tissues. Poor girl is running around backwards, knocking over everything. Bruce, sorry to hear that. Well, here you are, Priya. It's okay, baby. Come here. Priya. It's okay, baby. Here, you want to come to this? Let's start on this. Let them all see you're okay. Okay. Alright. She's still a little skittish, I guess. Bridgeport, that's an interesting one, Count. I only know so many ghosts from Bridgeport. I know a few. Maybe not enough to do a whole tour of just the ghosts.
That was the bugle tall rag, Benny Goodman's own arrangement. Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
Thanks, Blue Lurker, over on Twitch. And we do this every Thursday night and Sunday morning, just about. Now, the morning mini tours I can only do on the Facebook. I haven't figured out a reliable way to stream those elsewhere. But for the big ones, I try to have them on other things as well. Kelly, yeah, she'll be fine. Okay, Miles. Priya? It's okay, sweetie. All right, the cats wait all through for me to break out this thing. Tilt this down a bit.
Harlem way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about it. Trucking.
Miles, ready to hop down or what? All right. Here's the Miles. Whoa! Snatched you right out of my hands there. Good catch, good catch. See, when he gets a really good grip on it, I don't know what he expects me to do with it. All over town. Good jumps. All right. And if you're on the Patreon, you should be able to just hit message. Oh yeah, on the Patreon, if I'm going to be plugging that, there's up to 4 posts a week come in. You get on every tier, you get a Chicago history story every week and a coyote photo every week. Then on Deep Research, you also get more vintage articles about whatever the history story was. And there's an H.H. Holmes tier where you get something out of my huge H.H. Holmes archives. Plus, you could be entered into Waffles for copies of books like Murder Maps. Whoa! Up here, you want to show how you really jump? Oh, there's a good one.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
Good catch, Miles. I gotta zip up to see what we're congratulating Jordana for. Oh, congrats on the annual review, Jordana. Adam and the Amazing Leaping Cats. Good job being productive, Nicole. It is called the Cat Catcher, and really it's just a dangling mouse on a wire. But they love this thing. They're on their second one. They sell them at a store called Pet People. There's one in Evanston. I got it at the one in Lake Forest. I haven't been to the one in Evanston. I initially got it because when Priya first came here, Miles seemed kind of depressed about having to share his toys, so I went to get one that would be just a Miles toy. And at the same time, film the old Lake Forest Town Center designed by Howard Vander and Shaw. But Miles ended up just loving this thing. A couple weeks ago, I had to do another Lake Forest tour, just so I could go get him another one. The highest tier on Patreon is the tickets tier. On that one, if you're on that one, not only do you get everything else that goes on the Patreon, but you're also entitled to a free walking tour ticket per month. All you have to do is write me before a tour and say you want to use one.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and we stay right in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago and dance some more to Benny Goodman and his orchestra, and hear Helen Ward sing Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Some of your jokes. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catch a jumping cat by the toe. Let it fly away. Karen, I have not seen Big Sky. Miles is still underneath me jumping after this thing. Welcome. If you're just joining us now, you are into the post-show after hang. It was at 8 o'clock Central. But if you wait till a couple of minutes after this ends, it'll be up on the video section of Mysterious Chicago or on the youtube.com/Adam Saltzer.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
Trying to think if I ever had an annual review or anything like that go well. No, I don't think so. Well, of course, my gift to myself is this mug, just like the one they keep drinking out of in Get Back, the ones that have apple core. Super excited to have this, not gonna lie. Now I just need every single outfit they wear in Get Back. Cindy, congrats! Kathy, Get Back is the new documentary about the Beatles' Let It Be sessions that goes for 8 hours on Disney Plus and features some of the greatest fashion you have ever seen in your life. Seems like the easiest thing to replicate was the mini Henleys that John and Paul are wearing with a black vest, but finding the right color is still tricky. It's worth getting Disney Plus just for it. Really, I've got shelves full of Beatles books, and going through all of them now, they're definitely missing critical information. When they talk about these early 1969 sessions. There's quotes in this thing that should have come up in every single Beatles book since. I know a lot of people who signed up for the trial just to see Get Back. Ah, Joanne, that sucks.
And here's a short encore portion of Benny Goodman's forthright invitation at the beginning of his program. Let's dance.
And yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite Beatle. Depends on which era we're talking about, I guess. And which week of that era. Kitty. Young lady.
We have been presenting the music of Benny Goodman and his orchestra from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Marie, that's quite true. Ringo is the one who never seems to go on an ego trip, even throughout the 1970s. When things got a bit rocky in that respect. But you know who really comes off looking bad in the movie? You know, Paul can be a bit controlling, but somebody had to be. John was unpredictable, but he always was. George was a bit of a curmudgeon at the age of 25, but he always was. But Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, he's like the villain from a summer camp movie. You just want to pelt him with eggs erroneous. Alright guys, Benny Goodman has finished off his set here. So I feel like it's probably time for me to wind things down. Once again, quick plug, join the Patreon or send me a message on Patreon to get entered into our first waffle. We don't do raffles around here. It's a waffle. It's a waffle. On the Patreon for Murder Maps USA, this handsome volume. Other than that, on Sunday morning, despite this saying 8 p.m., it is really Sunday at 10 a.m., we'll be doing Unsolved Mysteries from Chicago history. First time since, I think, May. And on Wednesday, 6 days from tonight, Time Travel Pub Crawl presents Drink Like the Dickens. Our second annual presentation of that one. But all right, everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam Saltzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours, saying to stay safe, stay strong, stay healthy, and of course, if you can, stay spooky, everybody.